Good morning, and thanks for joining our session on outsourcing everything. What we are going to cover over the next hour or so is a recurring question in the pharma development, pharma outsourcing sector. Is there a prevailing model for CRO? Is there a business model that will succeed in the future? Do CRO need to have scale, full service provision, or do they need to be specialized or nimble? To address this question, we have put together a group of senior executives with a successful track record in pharma development and pharma research. I will let them introduce one by one, and then we will cover some of the key points around this question.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Jacinta George, and I'm Managing Director of a contract research organisation in Reading called RSSL, Reading Scientific Services.
Good morning, I'm Ronald Openshaw. I'm Chief Executive of Simbec-Orion Group. We're a full-service clinical research organisation doing everything from first dose in human through to the last dose before registration.
Good morning, I'm Paul Doyle, CSO of Concept Life Sciences, who have both a life sciences division that do all preclinical work and also an analytical service division that provide analytical services.
Morning, Nick Ash, currently chairman of Epistem. Epistem is a preclinical CRO specialising in mouse models for inflammatory disease, fibrosis and related conditions. Prior to that, I was chief exec of Source Bioscience, again a CRO, broad spectrum CRO, doing everything from histopathology through to genomics and analytical chemistry.
Morning, I'm Nick Medcalf. I'm the Head of Advanced Therapies and Enabling Programmes for Innovate UK, part of the group of funding organisations that now comprise UK research and innovation. Prior to that, I was Professor of Regenerative Medicine Manufacture at Loughborough University, where I retain a visiting professorship. And prior to that, more than 30 years in industry, principally with Smith & Nephew, an internment with GSK, and also in the generic sector.
By way of introduction, I'm an investment banker. I've been doing and covering pharma services for 15 years, so predominantly focus on financing transaction, equity and debt, as well as M&A. So I've worked with most of the CROs, the CDMOs. I do not have a scientific background as my panel, but I think we can have a very open conversation about some of those trends. So outsourcing everything, just to set the scene before we jump into the key topics of the conversation. I guess we all agree that the market momentum is exceptional. Just looking at some of the KPIs that we have put here on this slide, there are circa 15,000 molecules under development. If you think there were only 11,000 in 2013. In 2018, pharma and biopharma have spent around $170 billion in research and development. 2018 will be another record year for biotech financing, probably above 55 billion. IMS is forecasting $1.2 trillion in prescribed drugs revenues by 2020. At the same time, you can see we are all aware the complexity of trials is growing, the churn rate is going up, the costs are going up. So what we want to address during this hour is there a model for CROs to help sponsors unlocking this market momentum? And again, is it size, is it full service provision, or is specialization? The way we have tackled this question is through two angles. The first angle is we have looked at what the procurement needs of the sponsor, the different class of sponsors are, so large cap pharma, small, mid-sized biopharma. The second angle is what sort of service needs are required across the different phases of the pharma value chain. So the first point then is what are the procurement strategies of the different groups of sponsors? And I think Ronald and Jacinta will start sharing some of their view on this aspect.
Okay. So for me, I think the big challenge is who are you? and what is it that you're trying to get out of the studies that you're running. So if I may, Vincenzo, I'd like to get a quick show of hands in the room. So hands up everybody who's actually developing a drug. Okay. Those people who are smaller companies, let's call it small to mid versus the big companies. Okay. And those people who are big cap developers. So instantly we've got a split in the room. All of the small cap people, if you put your hands up again. Sorry, interactive this morning. No, it's 9 o'clock. Could you keep your hand up if you're going to take your drug to market yourselves? Ah, so I've got one very brave gentleman in the corner. Oh, sorry, two. And that is, I think, part of, thank you very much. I think that is part of the key here. And Vincenzo, you and I talked about this a couple of weeks whilst we were preparing for this. And the question is, how are you going to create value from your drug? Because that will determine what you do with your development plan. And that very much feeds into the sort of people that you need around you. So for the people who are planning to take the drug to market yourselves, clearly what you need is to do everything in your clinical development program. You need to do all of the studies, you need to do them all in the right order, and you're consciously thinking about the Food and Drug Administration first, because 45% of the world's pharmaceutical market is in the United States. You'll be thinking about the European Medicines Agency second. You'll be thinking about the UK Brexit probably sometime in about 10 years' time once we're no longer part of the EMA. And you're consciously thinking about that development path. But for everybody else in the room, and this is where, as a similar recovering investment banker, I'm on the 12-step program to not doing deals. The reality is you need to create value. So your value creation point isn't taking that drug to market. Your value creation point is taking that drug either to a licensing transaction, or I'm sure Vincenzo would be delighted to help you out in an M&A transaction, because then it's about what's the beauty in the eye of the beholder. And that beauty in the eye of the beholder is creating enough value that the purchaser wants to acquire, and then having something saleable to that party and doing something about the information asymmetry between what big cap knows and what you as a small cap player knows. And I think that, and I'm sure we'll develop that thing, Vincenzo, I think that is where the choice of the right player, whether they are a strategic player with a particular skill set, as some of my colleagues are, or whether it is somebody like us who are a full service provider, or if you're a big cap player, if you're a big cap pharmaceutical company, then you should be looking at the big cap CROs. So for me, it's very much about choosing the right partner with your commercial output at the front of your mind. And that commercial output, certainly from quick show of hands, is like 90%, not the FDA, it's your licensing partner. So as a starter, Vincenzo.
I would add, I guess, working in RSSL with a variety of clients that we have, it's less about what size you are. You could be an entrepreneur to a new biotech organization to a well-established big pharmaceutical company. What is core to you? And what is the non-core area that you want to hand out to someone else who does that work day in, day out? So as an analytical organization, we could be used in an ad hoc way, we could be used for long-term strategic relationships, or we could be used on a project-by-project basis where you use one lab today, one lab the next time you have another project as befits the solution. So the opportunity for yourself is to focus on your research and development, let someone else do the manufacturing, let someone else do the analytical stability studies, for example. And so, so yes, I would say, having thought about it, I would say there is a winning formula that can get you 80% there. It's looking at someone who has at their core the expertise, the experience that you're looking for, and hopefully they should have it in decades worth. Have they got the infrastructure? Have they got the capacity that you can switch on, switch off? Have they got the opportunity to invest in capital that avoids you having to make the same investment, and have that continuous investment in capital or talent that you need? And lastly, from a P&L perspective, That means you can then focus on not having that as so much as a fixed cost and a depreciation that you get associated with that, but more of a variable cost. So I would see people coming to us looking at what is non-core for them, but absolutely focusing in on the niche services. As we say, both works.
Absolutely.
In terms of audience, do you agree with the way we have started to address this question? I mean, if you're a large cap pharma, a large cap biotech, you're looking for something from the CRO, otherwise you're trying to find more a full service provider. I mean, is there any question around this first point?
So I have a comment, Scott Watson, Thermo Fisher. It's a little bit of a false choice because that you have to think about actually going to a niche provider, or you have to think about an integrated provider. Because Thermo Fisher routinely, we have the humility to say, you know, we're not great at this type of technology, so we subcontract work all the time. So we act like a big pharma in that respect with an integrated offering. If there's something we can't do, we'll go find it and just put that into our package.
That's very good.
And if I can, Scott, I'd absolutely pick up on that point. And I think that's really important because you've got to pick the provider who can meet your needs. So one of my sales professionals happens to be in the room, and if he came to us with a 10,000 patient cardiovascular study, he actually knows he'd be sent out of the room. Not that it wouldn't be a good study for us to do, it would be tens of millions of pounds worth of work to do, but we have no smarts in cardiovascular. And therefore, what we're doing is we very much specialise around a series of areas, oncology, rare and orphan diseases, respiratory and derms, where we have real smarts and where we have real knowledge. And I think, like you, what we've got to be as service providers is honest with our clients to tell them what it is that we're great at. And Thermo Fisher are absolutely renowned worldwide for your manufacturing capabilities and the skills that you have in that organisation, but being really honest with clients to be able to say, this is the stuff we do well, and this is the stuff that we don't. And I think it's when you come around to particularly the mega-CROs who are out there, who do try and tell you that they are going to do everything for you, and certainly for the majority of people in this room, they'll pitch with the B team and deliver with the D team.
I think if we don't hog the show too much,
We'll let the others get a word in edgeways.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, I'll come in on that since you've riled me with the B team and the A team there or whatever. Our company is very much split between delivering value through intellect, if you like, adding value through the scientific knowledge we've got, and delivering analytical services. And I'm in absolute awe of our analytical services division. They can do stuff really quick, high quality. They can deal with millions of data points. And we've heard lots of discussions about big data, what you can do to mine that. But fundamentally, as much as you can look at the business side of things, what are the numbers that say how many drugs get through? We might have tens of thousands of drugs in development, but I can guarantee that the FDA next year will do 40 or 50 approvals. So we can do the process stuff quite well. We've got access to really great science. We can start to unpick things that are really complex. But at the end of it all, we're getting something fundamentally wrong, that we don't know enough about the biology. Clinical trials can fail because they're designed poorly, but more times than not, they're failing because they don't show an effect that's been all along the way in test tubes and animal models. It's looking good, but suddenly it falls over. So if I have to say who should you outsource to, I think it's horses for courses. There are some areas where you can generate the data, and that's great, it'll be quality data. Number one is, how do you interpret that data, and how does it fit into the big story? And I think going back to fundamentals, and if people can go through really efficient processes, and we see examples of that, manufacturing, they're really good at that, we're green, we can do really clever clinical trials, we can do all of these sorts of things, but fundamentally we need to stop and spend some more money on that early phase, getting it right and asking the right questions, and not be fixated on doing it faster and faster, and let's fail faster. Why don't we succeed slower?
No.
That's good.
Any comment to Paul's statement?
Anybody disagree? That's interesting.
I think Paul anticipated the other angle from where we looked at this question is, are there specific services required in each of the different phases of the pharma value chain? Looking through CROs, lab services, CDMOs. And I guess, as you can see, I mean, going to Paul's point, we are trying to simplify the value chain of drug development, you know, in the 4 or 5 different phases, you know, from discovery to post-marketing, across what we say are the 4 key services: the clinical solutions, Roland, lab services, which is Paul, Nick, functional services, Jacinta, and the formulation development and GMP manufacturing. We will discuss 3 questions around this value chain. Is there specialization between core services? Is there a specialization based on development phases? And again, does a one-stop approach fit for all? Paul, Nick, I think you can continue on.
Can I pick up on the question of the phase 2 to phase 3 adoption? In the business of funding some of the higher risk areas of translational activity in this space, particularly for advanced and personalised medicines, one of the things that we've seen as a trend is that with the change in some of the administration pathways for modern medicines, certainly some of the short shelf life and personalised goods, we're talking now about changes in the way that the goods are supplied and delivered, often on a very short turnaround. Unfortunately, quite a few of these, as we've seen from the show of hands, are from an open innovation model. And one of the things that I think is missing, I'd be interested in the audience's view on this, is within the CRO and CDMO area, is that the extent to which the operational challenges are met early on. Because if we take a sort of ECV and valuation approach to each of these options, it seems to me that some of the highest risks in going from phase 2 to 3 and increase in numbers is that is where it shows, where the thing begins to creak at the seams, where the simplicity of administration and supply to small numbers becomes clear that something very different is needed at a larger scale. And the costs of doing that to some of the traditional models that we've had in the past become too high. And therefore, in terms of de-risking and getting adoption early, shortening the development path, it behoves an organisation to look at that aspect early on and reflect that in the manufacturing design. Without that reflection, there'll be a hiatus. Either the goods will not be adopted, or there'll need to be some return and repeat of early studies to accept the changes to the manufacturing pathway that weren't part of the comparability protocol. And I'd be interested to know whether that area is an impediment to any of our participants today, and if so, how it might be addressed in the present supply side.
Any different?
I was going to pick up on the point that you make there, Nick, and I think it's, for us, it's the one thing that we see more often than not with clients, where it's that we've got a problem. And it's not we've got a problem with regulatory, it's not we've got a problem with tox, it's not a problem with we've got something wrong with the clinical work, it's we've got a problem with manufacturing. And we can't make the batch. We've got, example we had 6 months ago, we've got small black particulate matter in a white powder. And it is about getting that manufacturing piece absolutely sorted. It's something we're not experts in. We can help get your drug from A to B, but I think it's down to making sure that the specialist providers can absolutely help their clients to make sure that that drug is ready for that clinical study, because you blow up a batch and you've not just lost the batch, you've lost the money in the batch, you've lost 6 months to be able to do that study, you've lost the time to get back in, and by the end of it, you've probably lost maybe a year to 2 years of patent life. And it's not patent life at the beginning. It's those last years of patent life at peak sales, and that's going to come off your value. So I completely support your point here, which is that getting that manufacturing piece right is absolutely essential.
So yeah, I mean, I think the CROs have to take responsibility as well, because earlier on, we're finding a lot of the conversations that we have with our clients is then focusing on what the next step is, and that's their goal, and rightfully so. But part of the responsibility of the CRO is to highlight the challenges they're going to face later on and give them the expertise or at least the tools to use proof of concept, so that you need to think about what is the next step, what's going to go into phase 2, what's going to go into phase 3. And I think the big pharma companies are starting to kind of communicate that as well by when they acquire companies saying, devaluing them if they haven't done this, because it increases the higher risk. So I think if we're going to say that we're CROs, like Concept is what I work for as well, the intellectual property that we put in there as well is explaining to them what's going to happen. Yes, that might get them to phase 1, but that's not compatible with large-scale manufacturing or large-scale capital fitting, whatever it is, and actually highlight that.
Do you think, sorry, just to ask a question to your question, do you think there isn't that full awareness of all of the stages and the pitfalls that ought to be more of a game plan that people are cognizant of?
So, to answer the question, I think that's not as widespread as people think.
Yeah.
We do a lot of what we call rescue formulations, and that's because people haven't thought about it. And so they try to push their phase 1 into phase 2, and it's not going to work. And they haven't thought about bioavailability or biocomparable studies.
So,
And so that slows it down. So then kind of everything's in a risk, they're on hold, and we have to do a lot of work very, very quickly.
so how would we get better as an industry then? What would?
I mean, as I said, I think the conversation, having that conversation, which is what we do later on, so companies come to us and say, look, this is the package, the integrated package we want to do. And we say, well, in parallel to that, these are the other things that you can do, and this is why you can do them, and this is why you should do them on it. And if you don't, this is the risk for it. And so we give them that package as well. And they can trigger that when they need to trigger it. But if they haven't triggered it, and then they get acquired, so quite a lot of the companies we work for get acquired, and then the big pharma comes in, and it's quite interesting seeing that conversation when everyone's in the room with them saying, why do you need to do A, B, and C? And I think that's starting to percolate down, but it is the responsibility of the niche providers to give that intellectual information, say, look, we've done this 100 times, and this is what you need to see.
But I think that highlights also that the breadth of people who come to CROs, be it for specialist or integrated. At one point you've got virtual companies who don't exist. They're going to have to go out to everything, and they have a whole world to choose from. At the other end of it, you've got a big pharma company who's probably retaining their development capabilities and are looking to pick out some cutting-edge research from a university, get a CRO to develop it, and then they take it in-house. So not only have you got a wide selection of what CROs can offer, we've got a wide set of needs out there who've also got that global community to pick from.
So I think when somebody comes to ourselves, we can either find that people say, I don't really know what I'm looking for, or there can be a tendency to tell I'm looking for analysis X. So actually building up that rapport and the relationship and starting to get to know a little bit more of your background, what is your goal and your aspiration, and therefore what are the series of tools and solutions that we could provide or could suggest somebody else that might partner with you. And it's that huge transparency and the rapport that you build up, the responsiveness between both parties. And I would say for all of us in this room, there's a bedrock of quality and science and service that I think for all of us now is just the assumed. On top of that, your provider should be somebody who is trustworthy, they're reliable. If you have a black spec, can they go into court and get your production line if that's what's needed, if you've got a counterfeit, But will they also be flexible? On Christmas Day, will they be working for you when everyone else is at their Christmas party? And will they be proactive? And those are the extra expectations that everyone should be looking for now in their contract partner, because your organisation will need that flexibility if they were your team in-house.
I think those behaviors are very important, but what they don't cover is what is the underlying detail that has changed in the past 5 years. If you go back to your own example, 2013, 2018, what has changed? ICH-Q11 came in around that time, 2012. The molecules that you're bringing to market, I'm assuming we're talking small molecules here because we have not defined whether it's biological or small molecules.
It's both,
Yeah, so
small and large.
Let's talk small molecules because I think I'm sensing the majority are from that area. The compounds coming to market these days are twice the length that they used to be a decade ago, broadly. And talking about the volume scale-up, that problem is declining because the quantities of these niche indications is coming down dramatically. But the data requirement of 10, 12 steps GMP with the complexity of critical process parameters and the behavior from the past to delay that development and investment into knowledge is where you find the friction almost in out licensing, because a biotech company that is not going to market is going to postpone that cost or park it with the owner, the future owner of it. Pharma has done this. They don't have the resources because to get a 15-step process to market, the amount of data you need to generate these days is tenfold the quantity of API you generate. And I think that is the conundrum where you have to define what is your challenge, what is the chemical complexity these days. Because it's not a single process that doesn't require multiple organic chemical conversions with very exotic reagents and custom RSMs these days. So having that complexity is what needs to be managed, and looking at what needs to be done here, there's a very key cross-functional capability required, called project management. How do you engage with the knowledge that certain providers have, but also the phase of your molecule requires in where it's going to be in development. I think that is a key topic that I see day to day.
And I think picking up on your point, our colleague's point over here, it is about defining that clinical development pathway from, depending where you are in that cycle, you've got to know what needs to be done to get it to registration.
Right.
Even though you're not going to take it to registration, you're going to out-license, you're going to sell the company. If you haven't mapped out that pathway as soon as you possibly can in your drug development cycle, then I think that is the key skill for any biotech or small cap or emerging pharma company. Because understanding that whole process and understanding whether it's the manufacturing problems or the clinical problems or the delivery problems, if you haven't mapped that out and if you don't know where those nodes are, it's absolutely fine to pass that cost on to big cap pharma when they acquire your molecule. But be honest with them in the conversations. I mean, you and I have done more M&A transactions where they fall over at that end point because somebody's in that due diligence process and they go, oh, what do you mean you haven't done the QTC prolongation study and you're in phase 3? Because they haven't thought about it. It's perfectly acceptable to delay it. It's perfectly acceptable to delay some of those markers, but have a really good understanding. And I think, to your point, is use your partner to help you define that pathway. Whomever it is, if we're not specialists in manufacturing, but we'll go and talk to manufacturing specialists to be able to make sure that that works. We'll get our IMP management team to have that conversation, but map that pathway because I think that that is essential. That's how you create value, and it reduces that information asymmetry between you as the vendor of that molecule, that development program, to the big cap pharma. They've got all the resource they want. They've understood your clinical development program when they're engaging in due diligence, and they're looking to see what you know and what you don't know. Because when you don't know something, oh, that's £1 million off for the QTC prolongation study. Oh, that's what it costs. And I'll take another $1 million off because you were stupid enough not to recognise it at the beginning. And it's just a value game. And we see that all the time in both licensing and M&A transactions. So reduce the information asymmetry, use your partners to be able to define that process and ask those questions deep early on.
Yeah, shall I just come from it? We've covered an awful lot of ground there, haven't we, crikey, in a very short space of time. Further to Ronald's original question then, he asked who was from pharma and big pharma and small cap. Who here is then from a service provider, would classify themselves as a service provider? Excellent, thank you very much. And that is a camp I'm very familiar with. And Vincenzo's starting point was, are niche CROs a better answer than mega-CROs, and I think we've touched on some of those elements as we've gone along. But interestingly, from running a CRO, day to day, do I sit there and strategize about whether a mega-CRO doing lots of things is better than a niche player doing a small number of things? The answer is probably not. What I'm interested on a day-to-day basis is, can I make sensible business decisions that enable my business to grow? Okay, and that's governed by having a bunch of people that I need to employ, having a bunch of shareholders and stakeholders that I need to keep satisfied, and therefore out with any strategy about whether niche is right or mega-CRO is right, it's about what decisions do I need to make my business better. Okay, if I'm sat in a pharma company or I'm a project leader on a drug, I'm sure they're not thinking about, do I need to go to a niche provider or do I need to go to a mega-CRO? They're thinking, how do I de-risk the next business decision? Yeah? How do I go about making the right answer that doesn't result in a cock-up, that doesn't cost XD millions of pounds or XD years of delay? So each one of these individual decisions leads to some extent, the QED of where we are. So if I take my niche CRO model versus my mega-CRO, I think it's all based on, to take Vincenzo's value chain here, it's an element of an interaction between capability, how far along that value chain do I go from left to right or up and down in terms of core services, and then it's about capacity. How much of it can I do? How much of each one of those steps can I deliver? Is it 1 million samples? Is it 10 samples? And the answer is it doesn't matter. It's beholden on all of us to deliver the answer that the customers want in the best way that we can possibly do it. But if I want to get bigger and better as a business, I need to scale my business. For me, it's actually about reducing complexity. How can I scale a very complex business? If I do a little bit of all of that, it becomes very, very hard to scale that business. So if I want to scale my business effectively, then somewhere along the line, I have to reduce complexity. So is reducing complexity reducing the breadth of what I offer, or is reducing complexity reducing the capacity of what I can offer? And all of these sort of things interact on a day-to-day basis. And it's very much driven by your customers as well, big customers, small customers. If I'm talking to large pharma, invariably, they've got a pretty firm view of what they want. Yeah, they're pretty prescriptive in how we should be going about it. Okay, they're interested generally in volumes, and with volume comes price. Okay, so they're prepared to buy at a price point. If I then talk to a different set of sponsors, some of those sponsors may not have the breadth, may not have the capability, they need to insource that capability, and that's a different value proposition, isn't it? So I'm sorry I missed your name from Thermo, but it's exactly the same thing. There comes a point at which you recognise that you can or you can't do stuff. And to talk to Jacinta's point about trust, that's exactly where it's at. If you cannot identify what you're good at offering, and then you try to offer it anyway, whether it's capability or capacity, you're doomed. You're doomed as a business. Your customer interaction is absolutely doomed. So a lot of it's driven by the customer, notwithstanding what the molecule is, big, small, or otherwise. And for those who know me, I do like analogies, and Ronald touched on it before. It's out there. It's the difference between being an artisan baker, and allied bakeries and Hovis or Warburtons, if you like. If I want an artisan loaf and I want 10 of them and I want sesame seeds and whatnot on, I will go to an artisan baker. If I go to an artisan baker and ask for 10 million of those tomorrow, they're going to laugh at me. If I want 10 million of those tomorrow, but I actually want my white sliced loaf cut a little bit more thinly than Hovis cut it, they're going to laugh at me. So somewhere in between, I don't think there's a right and wrong answer, somewhere in between that spectrum there's an entire continuum, isn't there, of finding not niche in terms of size, but niche in terms of your expertise, your capability, and the trust and the confidence that you build with your customers. And I think all of that sort of comes into play.
So one other factor which I think is worth considering is how the industry's changed from the 2013 to 2018. And if we think about it, big pharma, probably around 2013, maybe a bit before, was much more willing to buy compounds earlier on. And now they're kind of looking at phase 2 and phase 3. So the expectation is now the small and medium-sized biotechs have to take the products further, which wasn't their expertise and isn't part of their knowledge. So going back to your point about the CROs and expertise, their expertise has now changed into covering a larger breadth of it and having that knowledge to be able to take them further in an efficient manner, because the big pharma just walked away from it and they're taking their own internal resources away from it as well, and expecting the CROs of the world to kind of fill it up. But the knowledge gap is not so present in some of the biotechs, realizing that they have to go further. And when they started up, when the model started up, they potentially were thinking of finding R&D and selling then, and now having finally got to go further and further.
I'd like to pick up on that actually. The point you made just now was, which sectors are we talking about? As we move from the very small molecules to the biotech and onwards, my perception is that quite a few of the leading innovators are precisely the leading innovators because they've got deep experience in the core biology and the therapeutic targets and so on, and almost by implication, less of a perspective on manufacturing and operability at large scale. And I think the key to exit at the point you just highlighted is making it adoptable by the organisation that's going to acquire the IP. And what is the cost of adoption? Well, it's not simply that there is an established process for manufacture, it's that process can be operated at the required scale. Perhaps that scale requires multiple sites. It may not, but it might do, in which case the stuff that comes to the fore is an understanding of the human factors in maintaining the critical quality attributes, as well as the effect of a specialised supply chain, maybe specialised primary packaging and administration tools and so on. These things don't necessarily feature strongly either in the minds of the inventor or in the minds of those they've done early work with. And I think it would be useful to almost have default criteria somewhere in the public domain. A bit like a few years ago, we all referred back with mesenchymal stem cells to a key paper in cytotherapy that gave the key criteria. We almost need a sort of an industrial process adoption set of key criteria for certain categories. Almost like a public domain template for phase gate criteria. If I want to sell my product and it has the following categorical properties, I want to sell it at this point, what should I have covered off, at least in principle, rather than having one of those difficult conversations where it's revealed that there's a big gap in understanding about operability at scale. I can think of a few specialist service providers who look at those kinds of issues, but they're not particularly common. We do look at some of them through the Catapult network for those who use them, and the Centre for Process Innovation or the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, but there are other private companies that offer these services, but I don't often have conversations with inventors for some of the advanced therapies who are aware that they even need to look at these issues. And that's the bit I think that's missing. My prejudice, if you like, is that we are spending an awful lot on R&D at the moment on some key, exciting new products, but actually the bottleneck is somewhere else. It's the adoption step in many cases. I'd be interested to know whether that's in the experience of the representatives here today. Because I have to make decisions about where we spend money to bridge some of those gaps.
Nick, if I can pick up on your point, I think it is absolutely correct. I mean, I've spent time, earlier part of my career as a banker, looking at all of these biotech companies, and the founders, as you say, those scientific founders, they know their particular place on the inside of a ping pong ball perfectly. And they understand that in depth that is really quite frightening. But they have no real drug development knowledge as to how they're going to take this thing to the next stage, how they're going to move it forwards. I think that's where you get that interface then with the investor group, who are trying to make sure that that company can actually mature from an idea to a putative product, to a drug in development, to a drug coming up towards registration. And I think you're absolutely correct that those challenges do exist. And it is for those people that work with our clients across whatever our discipline is to ask them some searching questions at the beginning of the relationship. More often than not, if I get the opportunity to speak to the clients and the sales team, try and keep me away from them, is to ask them the question, why are you doing that study? And they say, because I need to do a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. No, why are you doing that study? Why are you doing that study designed that way? I think this is where it comes to your point, Paul, that the big cap players come in and they demand stuff and they want it done their way. Now that's fine. They've got 10,000 people who can help design the program, help design what they want. They have that institutional knowledge, but Nick, I think you're absolutely correct. With those small cap people with really exciting science, they don't have those skills. Our smallest client is 2 people. I mean, and this lady, she's fabulous. She's in her mid-30s. She's taken something out of academia. She suffers from the Donald Rumsfeld problem in a way which is legion. The stuff she doesn't know would fill the annals of a library. And that's where she relies upon all of us to give her that knowledge, because she wants to run a virtual biotech company. She's been smart enough to get the molecule out of academia, but now the challenge is to actually turn it into something which is going to improve patients' lives.
So to talk to Vincenzo's point then, about where does she go with that, you know, mega-CRO or a niche CRO, well it's you know, can you do...
Well,
can you talk to a mega-CRO about
I would
one
argue you
molecule?
couldn't
You
talk
can't.
to Mega. You
No.
can't. Absolutely.
That is not a way to go. Can't be a way to go, can it?
Absolutely. I mean, we've coined a phrase internally, which is stolen from the physics community, which is about impedance matching. And the client has to be correctly impedance matched with the service provider. If you tried to put that particular client with, let's call them Equithia, you've got 50,000 people plays two. How is she going to get that level of detailed service that she needs in order to move her drug forward? And therefore, the service provider has to be correctly impedance matched with the client. Our sales team don't chase big cap pharma because we are not correctly impedance matched for big cap pharma. We've got a limited number of very large client relationships that we've had for the last 10 and 20 years, but we don't go and seek to find more because we recognise our impedance matching is with the correct client base to be able to make that need work. So I completely agree with you, Nick.
Yeah. Well, you do impedance matching and we do bakeries. I think it's fundamental.
So we'll have some nice electrical bread.
Somewhere on that continuum.
Toast.
Yeah.
I think when you have any, sorry, Paul, I think when you have any rapport and you match two companies together, what we've always found that works really successfully is that you have a point person on each side of the fence, if you like, because you can't just assume that you throw things out to an outsourced provider, because probably all you'll get back is gobbledygook or just numbers. And what we find is that in those best situations, those point persons can say, this is what we can do, this is what you need. You get your contracts, your technical agreements, but honestly, I find people still need to talk. You can write down whatever you like with legal teams, but people still need to talk. We have samples that come in, and when they're labelled, we still need to talk. And so those point people are very important to have, those regular dialogues, the regular calls, the regular meetings, because things will go wrong, and they sometimes do. And the natural assumption can be to say, it must be the outsourced provider that is at fault. And actually, you need to build up that rapport so that when something goes wrong, both parties can be upfront and transparent so they can work through it quickly together.
I think you also need someone who's got an overview, and somebody mentioned it before about you've got to be seeing 2 or 3 steps further ahead. So it's no good going for tox studies if actually your stuff is fairly brickdust. You've got to have got that formulation right, which sometimes is further down the road than after you've done the tox studies, before you can do sensible making tox studies that are going to give you the right information. So someone's got to have that view of where we're going and be matching up. Fine, you can match up individual experts, but unless you've got that overview, consequences you take step here are going to have impact steps several down the road.
It's that whole development part, Paul. And unless you have that, you're missing out on the fundamental part. And it comes to all of the skills of the people talking today.
I think we have a couple of questions. First.
Hi, Ian McGrotty, Pharma. I'd like to come to your point on Ronald about the impedance matching. I'm not 100% sure I totally agree.
Okay.
The fact is, we're people, and people interact with people.
Yep.
So regardless if you're sitting in a room and you've 2 people and you get 50,000 people on either side, you get, I think to your point, you've got one person talking to one person. You know, I've been in this industry a long, long time. I've never, and I'm a salesperson, I apologise, but I've never sold to anybody I've never met. I've never sold to anybody I haven't built up a rapport with. So it doesn't frighten me if I go to a small company or a large company. My approach and my attitude is exactly the same. So I'm not too sure who's at fault there. So I would never go to a client and say, you know, I'm sorry, you're far too small for us to deal with. What does that make that us look like as a business, but also what does that make them feel like as a human being? So we interact on a one-to-one basis. So I'm not saying, just my feelings on that, you know, it's a very valid point, but I think we do fundamentally break it down into absolute common denominator. We are people and we talk, and as long as we talk and as long as we communicate effectively, we should break down any barriers of any business size, and that's something
that sounds fantastic. I think there is an operational reality. If you're a $1 billion company, your primary customers are the $100 million big pharma customers. They're going to get priority 1 always. They have the platinum treatment. they knock off the flight is not the person that you have been engaging with one-on-one. They will choose to knock off the small 2-people company because they cannot afford to upset their number 10 list.
I'm going to
So-
disagree.
I think
I'm
there's
going
a
to
question.
disagree.
There's a question here.
Absolutely. We wouldn't be in business if we said, right, based on your turnover, you're going to get that hierarchy. So we have to be open and honest with people. We have a rota, we have a service that will provide an accelerated service, but we're in business because we're open and transparent, and you can be the biggest pharma company in the world, but if the company in front of you has put in a contract before you, that's who will get served first.
It depends on you. Sorry, I'm just saying. It depends on
Yes.
how you define mega-CRO, because I would agree there are mega-CROs out there that do
Yes.
operate that principle.
Okay, good luck.
So I fully agree with Jacinta. So Thermo Fisher, we have 800 clients, and only 20 are in the top 20, right? And so it's all about mindset. And now sometimes it's maybe difficult to find the right folks. We have to navigate our organization, but we are completely focused on those 780, and it's all about corporate and executive mindset. When the executives have the right mindset, you absolutely treat that two-man in a molecule the right way.
But that's about actually being adaptable and flexible and communicative, and actually understanding the need of every single client that you actually have, because some people want everything, some people just want one thing. And so to listen to people and have that flexibility around your business is actually what you actually need. And all of this discussion is about communication, trust, and finding expertise. And actually, how you do that is how you actually are planning your path through your drug discovery.
And I think communication is really the challenge here. This slide is very simplified. I mean, to the point that there should be cross-functional expertise. In reality, it doesn't exist, because, if you think clinical solutions are pretty focused on the clinical solutions. They can do some services on the labs, some functional services, the formulation development, GMP, they are focused on formulation development, GMP. They might do some labs, but you do not have someone who does all the 4 functions. And therefore, to the point of the audience, as well as the panel, how you can find a way to bring all together in the same room. And again, sometimes it's easier when your sponsor is a small company, 5-6 people company. Sometimes it gets very complicated or challenging when your company is a large cap pharma, where they have different silos, different procurement strategies.
Vincenzo, can I add one thing? Because the contract research world, analytical certainly, and clinical, I believe is also growing at a very fast rate. Our analytical testing market is growing at between 6 to 16% year on year, so it's phenomenally very, very attractive. It does mean that when you connect with an outsource partner, I think to Philip's point earlier, you are getting a view into the much broader pharmaceutical arena, and that means you can get an eye for the trends and the themes to be watchful for. As we were saying, we can help guide you. Some of those outsource partners, say like ourselves, have a broader service offering, and so may focus in agrochemicals or in herbals or in foods. And in general, if they're focused on the whole FMCG market, they can have a feel for what is important to consumers and potentially what are threats to consumers' well-being. So, for example, because we have a food angle, we're watching for nanoparticles, we're watching for microplastics, we're looking at the whole world of focusing on microbiota and where that can be an enabler towards managing for some cardiovascular ailments. So it does actually help that some of your outsourced partners can be a link to a much broader arena that perhaps isn't always leveraged as much as it could be.
There's a question there.
Hi, yeah, so Rob Aitchison here, head of outsourcing and contracts at Pharma UK. A lot of things that we've heard, we've talked around before, and ultimately, the model you choose is going to be very dependent on your company. And there's no company that can't outsource now. So I was wondering if I could just take the conversation in a slightly different direction, looking at value chain. Ultimately, the way that we've been working with CROs for the last 20, 30, however many years, still comes down to 2 basic costing models, which are time and materials and fixed price. Given what we were talking about yesterday with regard to disruption, what has been happening in our industry to look at different ways that we can engage with each other to to really sort of realise some of this value. So I'm looking at things like value-based outsourcing. If we take into account the model that was used between Rolls-Royce and I think it was Boeing in terms of their servicing, that they will pay more for the amount of airtime they get, time of the plane in the air. What can we do in our industry, bearing in mind that we work in a very different way and our revenues come from very different areas? What is happening, and what can the panel give us any guidance on about how we can structure new deals between CROs and sponsors?
Well, I've opened my mouth. I'm not sure what I'm going to say.
That's the honesty point. That's the honesty point.
I was just thinking that someone like Innovate could be very helpful there, or someone just to broker that kind of discussion, because I don't have an answer, but I think it's an extremely worthwhile question, and we're very profit and loss orientated. So there is perhaps other ways to do this and to have more absorption of the risk. And where I found the government, the Innovate, the different organisations the government has, could be a broker towards bringing those people together and facilitating those kind of conversations.
Yeah.
So
Okay, I'll add to that then, as you've said it in, Jackie. So of course it's really important for the work that we do at Innovate to bridge the gap for the early de-risking, the point before private investment really wants to pick up. And just like the private investors, we have to choose the areas where we're going to make the most difference with the public money. At the moment, if you look at the work that we are doing and think, well, what is still yet to be explored, we've put the Catapult network up to try and introduce some of the early activity that perhaps uses different tools and techniques to the established stable that would be more popular with the CROs and the CDMOs. We put the Innovation Loans Scheme out, which, contrary to popular belief, is not a replacement for grants. It's a supplement to it. In fact, at permissive terms to add to the private investment. To your point about what more we could be doing, I think there's two key areas, and I'd like to roll these out for comment and happy to pick up afterwards as well. One of them is, I'm interested in ways that we can broker meetings between groups of users, potential innovators or people who want to build up a process or business, and the providers of tools and techniques in such a way that we can, as it were, create common interest groups. Because I'm aware that some of the providers, and there may be some in the audience today, have a bit of a challenge in that the newer therapies often require unusual routes for manufacture, and therefore the kit doesn't actually exist. That might be on the analytical side, it might be on the operational or manufacturing side. And if you're presented by one request, well, that company might be here tomorrow, it might not. So do you get involved in trying to develop that service? Probably not a good bet. But if you've got a common interest group, then you know that a certain proportion of them are going to be around in 5 years. So it's probably worth your while if they're presenting you with the same user requirement spec for something they need. And I think there's something perhaps we could do in that space. And the other point, and this is completely speculative, is a few years ago when the RDAs were still in existence, there was some interest in whether it was possible to form collaborative enterprises between complementary providers of services and activity, and to provide some sort of revenue sharing approach that would benefit all parties. It's been shown in microelectronics, maybe it would work in healthcare and pharma. I'm interested to explore that space as well.
To this point, we have 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
Perhaps we collect last couple of questions
Don't just
before
make
we
two comments
wrap
to
up.
that though. One is, I think common interest groups will work in pre-competitive areas.
Yes.
But right at the sharp end at research, that the most popular thing that outsourcing people come to us with is, can we risk share with you? Now, that's a great idea, but we're doing research so that the outcome isn't certain. And secondly, for a service industry which is driven downwards by price, unfortunately, it is quite an investment to make to be able to say, yeah, we can risk share. Some big corporations can do that, and they're very successful at it. But that is a different model, but it's very difficult for the service providers to be able to buy into that.
So
There was a question.
So I think the point that the gentleman from Ono made, because the Rolls-Royce equivalent in pharma would be, can you extend the useful patent life of the product afterwards? Very hard to identify, but if you could find a way to make use of the faster regulatory pathways that are out there right now, the 4 or 5 fast track and priority review and all those things. If somehow you can come up with a model that addresses that, acknowledges that, and then you share a benefit after the fact, which I don't think has been done yet. I think that is a novel model which pays for performance, and time is of real value these days.
Any other question before we wrap up? I'll try to wrap up with the slide we began with. We all agreed the momentum is very strong. It also brings new challenges. I mean, we did say that 80% of the new chemical entities are held by the small, mid-sized pharma. There are other challenges around cost, around churn rate. And what was evident from this conversation that although there is no cross-functional expertise, communication between different functions is becoming much more important. So to the question, is there a winning formula to provide the best service to sponsors? The view is perhaps there is not a clear-cut service provision, but obviously there needs to be the right level of expertise and the right level of openness to talk to other parties to address challenges earlier and provide the best service to your sponsors. Thanks for joining the panel.
Thank you.